Hello everyone, I'm the Enforcer, and welcome to the breaking news. Please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and support us on Patreon, link in the description below. Today, we have breaking news from quite literally every single corner of the world, from Europe to Ukraine, and all the way down into the Middle East, as well as East Asia today. We've been able to hear a lot of news. Starting off, we've been able to hear that the Ukrainian counteroffensive in the Pokrovsk area is continuing to put the Russians on the back foot, as the Russian Federation appears to be pulling in higher-level artillery systems of a heavy caliber to attempt to try and slow the Ukrainian offensive, although it appears that these reinforcements are taking considerable losses at this point. We have been able to hear within the Pokrovsk direction that Ukrainian counterattacks continue to drive down the roadways to Pischane and also towards Kotline, which is directly along the very front of the front line of the Russian Federation's armed forces south of Pokrovsk. From what we are understanding, it is an incredibly difficult situation for the Russian armed forces that are currently south of Pokrovsk at this moment, as it appears that the Ukrainian counterattacking forces may have a battlefield advantage. According to information that we have at this moment, we have been able to hear, as of yesterday, that Russian logistical support to this frontline area is completely non-existent. According to the information that we have, Russian logistics does not exist 18 kilometers from the front, and the only area that appears to be somewhat safe from Ukrainian drones, artillery, and the counterattack at large is the city of Seladove, which Russian Federation forces have attempted to create into some form of a defensive bastion of a sort of the entire front. Beyond that, outside of Seladove, everything that is about, roughly to measure, about 9 miles in front of Seladove is currently being jeopardized at this point because they simply lack the ability to conduct a proper resupply of those troops, reinforcements for that matter, or really protect them at all from any kind of Ukrainian superior firepower advantage in terms of drones or artillery. For this reason, the Russian Federation seems to be doing incredibly badly within this front, and it is entirely possible if the Ukrainians are somehow able to keep up their momentum and pressure that they may be able to push the Russians back towards Seladove and once again reestablish a front line near to Pokrovsk and stop the Russians from possibly threatening the rear flanks of the city like it nearly turned into right now. Nevertheless, the Russian Federation is attempting to stop this possible Ukrainian push where they will drive the Russians back to Seladove, as we have been able to see that the Russians are bringing in higher caliber artillery systems such as the TOS-2. The TOS-2 is an improvement upon the TOS-1, and while the two systems look completely different from each other, they largely are very similar in their operation. This right here is a TOS-1, something that a lot of people have been familiar with throughout the entirety of the war. It is an armored MLRS that carries thermobaric rockets to the front lines. It has an incredibly short range of approximately 8 to 9 miles. It's not an incredibly long firing distance, but the TOS-2 is an improvement in every single degree and metric over the TOS-1. It is much easier to reload, having a built-in reloading crane. It also is a lot more mobile, considering that it is wheeled instead of tracked. It also is able to carry a larger variety of thermobaric rockets, giving it about double the range as the original TOS-1, and these things are practically brand new and very limited in number for the Russian armed forces. It was put into service in 2021, just months before the beginning of the war in Ukraine, and since the war in Ukraine has begun, we're understanding that Russian Federation production abilities have been fairly limited on the TOS-2 thermobaric rocket launcher. Nevertheless, they are pulling out the rare examples of the TOS-2 that they have currently to try and provide fire support for those Russian forces that appear are being overwhelmed at this point near to the area of Pischane and Kotline. We were able to see, however, that the Ukrainians are largely thwarting these artillery efforts, as it appears the Ukrainian counter battery was able to locate and destroy one of the rare TOS-2s near to the area of Pokrovsk, and from what we're largely understanding, it was an incredibly dangerous operation for the TOS-2 to even get within firing range. The TOS-2 has a range of around 20 kilometers, and for it to be able to hit Ukrainian forces successfully, it actually has to be within that range on the front. This means that it cannot be 20 kilometers from the active front. It usually would be somewhere around 16 to 12 kilometers from the active front to be able to provide effective fire support and to be able to suppress or destroy Ukrainian forces that are not directly on the very front of the Russian front line. For this reason, this means that the TOS-2 actually moved into the area that is practically no man's land for vehicular support for the Russian Federation at this point. Remember how I said at the beginning of the video about the current situation at Pokrovsk that the Russians have claimed that anything 18 kilometers to the front vehicularly cannot survive? The TOS-2 was well within that 18 kilometer zone of death trying to conduct this fire mission, and for this reason, considering that it was one of the few vehicles in the area, it was targeted and destroyed by Ukrainian armed forces. Once again showing us that the Pokrovsk situation may be a lot more difficult than the Russians ever expected. Even still, it appears that the Russians Russians are not able to leverage their air power like they did in Avdiivka with the Fab glide bombs to be able to try and put themselves on a superior firepower advantage to the Ukrainian defenders, meaning that this offensive has stalled and most likely will stall well into the future, or the Ukrainians may be able to conduct a counterattack and actually put the Russians onto the defensive and push them back towards Seladove. Either way, the battle is not progressing incredibly well for the Russian Federation in this direction. And we have also been able to hear that inside of the Kursk direction, it is not developing well within this area either. We have been able to hear the Russian Federation Armed Forces have been conducting attacks, or counterattacks more so, against the Ukrainian-held town of Nikolsky, just south of Malaya Luchnia. Malaya Luchnia is a fairly important linchpin of this area of the Kursk front, as it appears to be the main bastion, or fortress, if you want to call it that, of the Ukrainian defense and offense within this direction. If the Russians were able to take Nikolsky south to Malaya Luchnia, they would be able to threaten the highway that the Ukrainians are using to travel from Sucha to Malaya Luchnia to resupply and reinforce Ukrainian armed forces within that direction, and this would jeopardize the entire Ukrainian front. With this in mind, the Russian Federation has attempted a counterattack today to attempt to take Nikolsky and once again drive the Ukrainians from the Malaya Luchnia and largely the Lgova highway that would start to directly jeopardize the E38 highway if the Ukrainians were ever able to conduct a significant breakthrough. The Russians did the stupidest thing imaginable, trying to conduct this counteroffensive. We cannot show you the video, but we can show a picture here from one of the videos published by the Ukrainian Armed Forces. The Russians sent out a small attack column comprised of a couple of infantry fighting vehicles along with dismounted infantry waving victory flags. So these are practically flags of the Soviet Union that were flown in Berlin in 1945, and they tried to attack Nikolsky in the middle of the wide open. It was a horrendous objective. From what we've understood, the entire attack column was destroyed and took incredibly high casualties. Most of the Russians that y'all are seeing in this picture right here that are dismounted and running, actually would not end up surviving. We can't show any of that footage here on a short war video. YouTube wouldn't really like that too much. But this attack went incredibly bad. It went so bad, as a matter of fact, that the Russians actually had to put out a statement about it on Telegram, stating that it was absolute carnage. And this is according to North Channel, which is a Russian Telegram channel, speaking about the situation inside of Kursk. Right now, it's just a complete mess near Nikolsky. The 155th column, effing L, under red flags, like at a parade, went head-on into a swarm of Ukrainian drones along a mined road. Don't rub your eyes, we wrote everything correctly, namely under the red flags of victory and along a mined road. Details will come later. We pray for the guys who are now in the fields. And then we got a later statement calling out specific Russian forces and saying that they were very choice words. But nevertheless, they said that this is betrayal and murder, what the Russians did to their own forces, although this is quite clearly a Russian commander-sanctioned action. There was an offensive effort to try and take Nikolsky back from the Ukrainians. But nevertheless, it does appear that the Russian offensive within this area went incredibly poorly, and we're not really expecting that the Russians will be able to make any sort of meaningful ground in this area, although we do have to note that at this point, it does appear that the Ukrainian offensives have largely fizzled out as well, and while they were able to claim a little bit of additional ground, the amount of ground gain is marginal at best. We're not going to be seeing that the Ukrainians are threatening any sort of a major Russian logistical point like Korenivo or Glishkovo, or for that matter, anything further down into the area Blyski district of the Kursk Oblast. We just do not believe that that will be happening anytime soon, but it does appear that the Ukrainians' position inside the Kursk Oblast is well battened down, and there's really no way for the Russians to uproot them or drive them back at this point, especially considering that the front lines have now been condensed and Ukrainian troop density and firepower figures are looking far more optimal at this point than it was when the Ukrainians were much farther stretched out. There was a lot more, I guess you could say, strategic possibilities or strategic advantages that could be posed by the Ukrainians controlling a large amount of ground, and that, of course, would be the more advantageous sort of position. But considering the elements that we're seeing right now within the Kursk Oblast, after the Russians were able to push the Ukrainians back a bit, it does appear that the Ukrainians will probably be able to hold this position for an incredibly long time. However, outside of the Kursk Oblast and the situation that we're largely seeing prevailing inside of Ukraine, inside of the Pokrovsk Oblast and in the Kursk Oblast, where it appears that the Ukrainians are conducting successful counterattacks and defenses, it appears that NATO has some criticisms about the battle tactics being used by Ukrainian armed forces in the field currently. According to what we're hearing, NATO officials are criticizing Ukraine for wasting Western arms by relying on Soviet-style tactics. Tensions are rising between NATO and Ukraine as UK defense sources criticized Ukraine's army for misusing Western-donated weapons. Ukrainian forces are using Soviet-style tactics, wasting expensive NATO equipment. Ukrainian troops misused costly in-law missiles, treating them like cheap RPGs, firing salvos worth over $100,000 instead of using NATO's precision tactics. Reports claim Ukrainian forces have abandoned Javelin launchers, some falling into Russian hands. The Russian army may now have more javelins than the British army, according to a British Telegram source. But nevertheless, this is something that has been brought up several times throughout the war by multiple different countries, the United States, Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, that NATO is supplying, of course, modern weaponry to the Ukrainians, but the Ukrainians seem to be using a blend of tactics, and more so tactics and strategies that would have been employed during the times of the Soviet Union. There's a very big difference, and there actually is a reason for the criticism that NATO is giving out. Soviet tactics largely require that there is a large volume of firepower that is cheap, inexpensive, and slightly effective. NATO doctrine largely revolves around there being superior firepower, but it is done through more expensive and precise weapon systems that hit the precise area of the target instead of just simply trying to overwhelm by throwing enough at the wall that it'll eventually stick. This is something that we have seen in the past being done by the Ukrainians in different kinds of vehicle categories. For example, Leopard 2s and M1 Abrams being operated as pretty much charging cavalry on the front lines without any infantry support. That usually is considered to be an incredibly deadly sort of a tactic, especially for any kind of a main battle tank, much less a Western main battle tank. You're really putting them out there in the open to possibly get destroyed. Another one that we really do know was a big issue for a while was the Ukrainian use of the AMX-10RC. The AMX-10RC being a light reconnaissance tank, or a light tank for the large part, of the French army. These have been provided to some Ukrainian units within the southern Zaporizhia area, and in the past we saw that the Ukrainians attempted to use the AMX-10 as a main battle tank, and quite obviously it was destroyed in fairly large numbers during that time, because this is a light tank, a scouting vehicle meant to engage in a small amount of combat if necessary with enemy forces, and then immediately retreat and report back the information that it found. This was something that the French pointed out very clearly, and it appears that some British sources are now saying that the Ukrainians are beginning to misuse British weapon systems like the in-law and some javelins as well, and largely using them as though they are cheaper RPGs. This is something that we do not really believe will be changing, and we have seen in the past that there's been a considerable argument for the Ukrainians not using NATO strategies and battle tactics, because most NATO strategies and battle tactics largely require precision strikes, but most importantly, the first kind of precision strikes ever conducted under normal NATO doctrines would be by the Air Force. And considering that the Ukrainians don't really have a significant enough Air Force to be able to achieve air superiority, conduct SEAD operations, and then conduct precision air-to-ground strikes, it's really hard for the Ukrainian infantry to be able to do so as well, because they are pretty much having to carry the bulk of the firepower of the Air Force that they do not have, as well as all of their armed forces on the ground. This means that they still have to largely emphasize the Soviet model of not having an air force and just attempting to overwhelm the enemy through superior firepower on the ground with artillery and infantry, as well as tank support, instead of relying more heavily on an air force that's able to conduct precision strikes, and then the infantry would move in to mop up whatever remained. But still, it does appear that the West is adamant on supporting Ukraine, especially the European Union, and we have been able to hear something incredibly interesting as a development with that as well. We have been able to hear that the Ukrainians are not going to be accepting any kind of bilateral agreements at this point in between the United States and the Russian Federation, leaving Ukraine and Europe out of the negotiations. According to what we've heard, at every meeting and in every discussion, we have consistently maintained that any dialogue on European security cannot take place without Ukraine and the EU. Reports about meetings with the Russians are fake. There have been no such meetings, nor are any planned until we develop a concrete plan. The president of Ukraine has addressed these questions clearly. We discussed security guarantees, and the president made it clear that any agreement without Ukraine will not be accepted. The involvement of the United States in security guarantees is essential for us. We will never make decisions that go against Ukraine's sovereign interests. It does appear that at this point, the Ukrainians are making it incredibly clear that a bilateral agreement only in between the Russians and the United States will not be supported or backed by Ukraine. And we have a large reason to believe that the European Union will largely ignore any sort of a Russian-American agreement as well, and continue on supporting the Ukrainians while well on into the future until they're able to get to the negotiating table and actually achieve a meaningful peace that is able to make both sides equally unhappy through some form of a diplomatic compromise. But nevertheless, we have also been able to hear at the exact same time that it does appear that a Ukrainian delegation did arrive in Saudi Arabia a little bit earlier ahead of Zelensky's visit, and we are now hearing that Zelensky has arrived in Saudi Arabia days before the arrival of the U.S. and Russian delegations. Apparently that post was deleted. We did get to see the video right beforehand, so nevertheless, I hope that you'll take my word on that one, because it appears that the video is now gone, and it literally only popped up 6 minutes before I started recording this. But we also were able to hear something interesting as well, that the Ukrainians are still using the large volume of F-16s that they have currently in service, as we were able to see another F-16AM flying over Kyiv. It appears to be carrying a number of GBU-39 guided bombs, as well as some AIM-9Xs and some AIM-120Cs, a very well-equipped F-16. And not only that, it appears that it may have some sort of a targeting pod below. I can't really see very clearly. That looks like it may be a targeting pod attached to the bottom of the fuselage, and it also has 2 external fuel tanks as well. It appears that the Ukrainians are not cheaping out for the large part on their F-16AMs and the amount of armaments that they have during their sorties. They appear to be incredibly well equipped at this point, and it does appear that the Russian Federation may be a little bit more concerned, as the Ukrainians are getting access to an even larger number of F-16s and other Western aircraft here in the future as time continues to pass. But nevertheless, we have also been able to hear of something else that has been major as well inside of the area of East Asia. This is something that is a small change, but it may lead to larger diplomatic consequences in the future, because there appears to have been a quiet change on U.S. policy towards Taiwan. And this is directly from the Department of State's website, meaning that this is largely an official change by the United States, but the United States has again made changes to the wording on the official page detailing the U.S.-Taiwan bilateral relationship. The portion that said we do not support Taiwan independence has been removed. It is this area right here that has been crossed out in red that no longer appears on the Department of State website's statement about U.S.-Taiwan relations. It appears that it's important to remember that the overarching U.S. policy on Taiwan and the U.S. acknowledgement of China as the legal government in China, while not recognizing their sovereignty over Taiwan, has yet to change, but we're already starting to see changes made to the Department of State's website. This may be possibly a prelude to the United States now moving towards supporting Taiwanese independence from the Chinese mainland as some sort of a diplomatic negotiating standpoint, or possibly as a move to once again reaffirm the Chinese containment along the the Western Pacific island chain that exists through Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, and other countries that are in the South China Sea. It may be entirely possible that this is leading up to that sort of a move, but for now, it only appears to be a simple website change that statement was removed, but hopefully we'll be able to see that U.S. relations with Taiwan continue to be on an incredibly good posture, as it is critical to Chinese containment. But nevertheless, that is all of the news that we have today. I've got to thank each and every one of y'all so much once again for watching this video, and if y'all have enjoyed and made it to this point, please make sure to put Pokrovsk in the comments section for all of the Ukrainian forces that are currently conducting the counterattack at Pokrovsk successfully right now. And if you've also made it to this point in the video, please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. We put videos out like this pretty much every single day whenever there's enough news. And also, we try and make sure to keep them well informed. So hopefully this stream was well informed and sound well researched, because we try our best to make sure that all of them are like that. And I also got to give a huge thanks and a shout out to everyone who has been supporting us on Patreon. All of you folks make these kinds of video projects possible, and we're incredibly happy and appreciative that so many of y'all continue to enjoy this channel and the kind of videos and news that we put out. And so with that, we will see you all in the next one. And good luck and take care.